Welcome once again to another episode on the archaeology of Egypt with Mistai. This time we're going to be looking at Egyptian temples, especially the idea of sacred space and how it's expressed in Egyptian society. This kind of knowledge, embodied in the architecture, the mythology, and the sacred writings that we have from Egypt in terms of papyrus, have profound implications for how magicians, both ancient and modern, create sacred space, go about their relationship with the landscape and creating circles, those of you who do, but it also has profound implications for our understanding of Egyptian religion and culture. Before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the little notification bell down at the bottom of this video so you get notified every single time I upload and you don't miss an episode. I would love to have you as a part of this community. Let's get into it. Now I'm going to pull up some images here for visual aids. Those of you who have read the Asclepius, the Hermetic tractate, otherwise known as the Perfect Discourse, will know that Hermes has a rather interesting thing to say about Egypt. He says that Egypt is really the temple of the whole world. And when we look at the perspective of an Egyptian city, that really couldn't be more true. The city in Egypt is really, it's the domain of a specific god. And the Greeks actually capture this in terms of how they name the Egyptian cities. Crocodilopolis, Heliopolis, Hermopolis, all these different kinds of names. They are communicating an original Egyptian concept that the city in ancient Egypt was the domain of a god. It was the house, the living physical embodiment of that deity on earth. In fact, the entire concept of a city is embodied in religion. To live in a city meant to be in proximity to the god that resided there. Being born in a city meant that you were under the care of the tutelary deity, essentially. And this is why Egyptians, especially from sort of the New Kingdom onwards, they really glorify sedentarism. You know, the act of staying home and having a home or having firm ground on your own soil. This was something incredibly important to the ancient Egyptians. In fact, they went to such great lengths that to be buried away from your home city was considered near sacrilege. People needed to be buried on their own soil so their deity could take care of them and their household spirits and the landscape spirits could take care of them after death. The rank of an Egyptian city, as far as we can tell, seems to have been proportionate to its holiness, and its holiness or its sacred rank is largely determined by its antiquity. So the older a city is, the more powerful and high-ranking it is as the cult center of one of the specific deities. Here's the thing though, for the Egyptians, a city was an entire temple. It wasn't just a residential area. The city itself was a living temple, a temple that was located on the primeval mound, the Ben that originally rose out of the waters of Nun and shone forth the light, or the first light of creation. It is the home and domain of an autochthonous deity, a deity that gives rise to itself. In a way, this meant that every single citizen living in a city in Egypt was a priest of that city. They were members of that collective unified temple. And the temple as a whole really seems to have been the center of kind of sort of civil, municipal administration in Egypt, essentially. The temple, everything went through the temple, everything came in through the temple on the way out, and it was the place through which all the city was congregated around, essentially. Every single person in the city almost belongs to this unified temple as sort of lay priests or laity, essentially. In fact, there are different kinds of priests in Egypt. There were certainly full-time priests, especially from the New Kingdom onwards, but there were also the kind of hour priests, which are usually much higher in number, and they served temples in a monthly rotation, essentially. So you had the full-time priests who were kind of overseeing the central temple, but then the actual citizens themselves, the people living in cities, they would also have administered to the temple on a rotary basis at times. When we look at this core idea that the entire city is itself a temple, is itself the domain of a god, because bear in mind the god is embodied in the temple in its cultic statues, where the cultic statues are sort of animated theurgically, and they are embodied in the mythic and the cosmic landscape that we see inside the entire city. the religious notion of that city really achieves full display in the architectural form of the temple itself. So the city is an overarching temple, but then inside the city, you have kind of the temple proper, as far as we can tell, right? We have a lot of warped perceptions of Egyptian temples, especially stemming from movies, but for the most part, this is something that is really important and people don't understand the significance of the temple here. To illustrate my point, let's look at an image here of a standard Egyptian city. You have to think, most Egyptian cities, they did not have any characteristic structures outside of a temple, outside of maybe the royal residences like Memphis or anywhere like that, where there were royal palaces and administrative buildings. For the most part, every other building in an Egyptian city was made of mud brick, and they're largely very flat, right? They're very kind of uniform in structure, except for the temple, that is this towering pylon sort of glistening in the sun that can be seen from miles around. So you have this temple that's kind of looming over a lot of the mud brick structures, and it creates a striking kind of symbolism in the landscape. If anything, we can argue that the temple is the center almost of a city. That the entire city is built around the temple because the temple is the domain of the god. The temple even is what makes a city urban, or makes a city urbanized to a certain extent. By looking at city plans like this, we can see clear evidence of what we call theocratic feudalism. I'm often reminded of like European castles when I look at this kind of stuff, and it's one of the reasons I think it's so fascinating. When you look at sort of medieval Europe and you look at kind of the castles in the landscape where there are these sort of big defensive feudal areas that are occupied by the lord, and then around it you have the rest of the little villages. It's really the same kind of idea in Egypt, except that the temple almost doubles as the government place of the deity, right, or the ruling temple, or the ruling throne room even of a deity, right? Imagine sort of deities and spirits living inside their temple castles, looking out and surveying the land around them that they also own. That's kind of the perspective that I want you to take here a little bit. And now imagine that every single city does this. Because here we can see what the Asclepius means. When Asclepius says, or when Hermes in the Asclepius says that Egypt is the temple of the entire world, it really kind of is. Every square inch of the country is essentially like a room that's owned by a god. Every square inch has these temples dotted around, and the gods own all of the land in there. Picture Egypt as a giant temple, and every single city is its own individual room within that temple. That's what Hermes is getting at when he talks about this in Asclepius. Now, in native Egyptian, in the language itself, it distinguishes two kind of words or two phrases and concepts when we're talking about temples, for the most part. The first is the Egyptian word qer. Qer in Egyptian means house or enclosure of some kind. And as far as we can tell, it largely designates anything that belongs to the deity. The deity's possessions, it's house in sort of the traditional Hebrew sense, right? House as in lineage, or house as in everything owned in terms of property, and the deity owns everything in the land, essentially. Not only kind of the magazines and the extra rooms that are added onto the temples, or the workshops and the smithing houses, or the blacksmith forges and the granaries and all that kind of thing, but they also own all the workshops. The deity owns everything, essentially. In fact, according to the great papyrus Horus from the Ramesside period, the Prer of Amun, which was one of the biggest and most famous in all of Egypt, it owned around 590,000 acres of land at its height. And it was staffed largely by about 86,486 heads, which largely means people, for the most part, who lived and worked inside the domain of Amun. Right? So these are huge enclosures, essentially. Now, they also distinguish the Prer from another temple word, which is Khudnecher. And Khudnecher is kind of the temple proper, essentially. Like kind of the official temples, right? And these official temples, they are almost always built out of stone, as far as we can tell. There are a couple of instances where that isn't true. They make them out of sandstone or anything like that, or mud brick or something like that. Especially the Old Kingdom, the earlier temples are much more rustic and made out of mud brick. But the official temples are almost always built out of stone, at least sort of from the New Kingdom onwards, to distinguish them in terms of eternity. Stone is a very long-lasting material in comparison to that kind of mud brick, which falls away fairly quickly. So at least from the New Kingdom onwards, temples are always built from stone to signify that eternal quality to them, essentially. And like we were mentioning earlier, just in the same way as citizens are the officials or the priests of their city temple, the overarching city, they are the servants of that, essentially. The priests are often referred to as chemonecher, the servants of gods or servants of the god in terms of their temple, right? And generally, some people have asked me before how many people would have been involved in the Egyptian temple. As far as we can tell, the personnel of a sort of a normal temple, for the most part, let's say sort of your standard New Kingdom temple, it would have occupied, or it would have had about 10 to 20 priests working in it at any given time, at least sort of official priests. And they would have actually lived in houses within the temple enclosure, so they would have lived in the temple itself. But then again, like I said, there are also lay priests as well. These are kind of your rotary hour priests, which could have been taken from the community and people who sort of came into the temple from outside, and they would have continued to live outside of the temple for the most part, whether in workshops or in residential compounds near to the temple. Now, by drawing on textual and architectural plans, we can actually understand some of the symbolism and the meaning that went in to constructing the temple, the mindsets and the beliefs and the mythologies that make the temple so powerful in Egyptian thought. So let's begin with the Ptolemaic temples, the late stage temples, because the Ptolemaic temples are architecturally far more unified. They are far more standardized. They're largely built across the same manner, and we have a lot of inscriptions and documents talking about why they are built in that kind of manner. Then once we've established that, let's work back into the New Kingdom and back and all the way back and see if we can find some earlier ones. Sound good? Let's keep going. Most of these late stage temples, according to the inscriptions, they are mostly based on designs of the first temple. In Egyptian mythology, Amun, at least in the Theban cosmology, was the creator of the first mound. The mound, he sits upon the first mound and creates the world. He's the hidden god, right? The hidden one. And he creates the first temple. From the Ptolemaic period onwards, every single temple was modeled off of that first primeval temple that was made by the creator god on the primeval mound, the Men, at the dawn of creation. Let's look at some plans here, right? So let me pull up some images. This is a plan of the Temple of Horus at Edfu. It's fairly late, but it's one of my favorite temples. And when you look at this right away, I want you to take a moment and think, what are some of the things that clearly stand out for you? You know, in terms of the architecture, take a moment and have a look at the temple plan here. I'll be quiet for a second, drop some answers in the comments and have a discussion. But what sort of things stand out to you when you're looking at this temple, first and foremost? I think for me, so we can see on the scale here that it's aligned, the temple is aligned on a north-south axis, right? And at the entranceway, the first thing that sticks out to me is you've got those two huge pylon gateways in the south on the side of the temple, right? On the far side of the temple, the entrance, we've got these two enormous sort of pylon gateways that we can see here, right? Which is really interesting. And on the other end, we look sort of in the far left-hand corner of the image, which is the northern side of the image. We can see kind of the Holy of Holies right in the center of the temple. It's almost like surrounded by different sort of outward moving rooms, right? And that's a very important point, so we'll come back to that. But the Holy of Holies is kind of, it occupies a freestanding naos, occupies the Holy of Holies there, right? We can see that. Now, architecturally speaking, this naos is where the cult statue of the god would have resided, right? So the main sort of statue in which the god is embodied. Now, again, importantly, I want to make this very clear. The Egyptians did not worship statues. This is a very common misconception that we find in places like Hollywood and other media, even in modern magical literature. They did not worship statues. The statue is the living vessel for the divine energy that is omnipresent everywhere, essentially. It is a vessel of the god that has been brought alive through theurgic animation, so theurgic practice. That has brought the statue to life. And in fact, from the Ramesside period onwards, we have numerous accounts of statues moving and speaking and swaying one way or the other to indicate judgments. So statues would be brought into courts, or they would be brought in, or sort of brought into their main temple, and people would consult them for oracles. The statues would speak, they would move, and they would give people visionary experiences that would answer their questions. So these things, at least in the Egyptian thought, are very much alive in themselves. And there are parallels. The Asclepius talks about this with statue animation. And later on, even the Chaldean oracles talk about telistike, which is sort of theurgic statue animation from the Neoplatonic perspective. So this is clearly a very Egyptian practice here. The naos, where this deity statue and therefore the deity itself is centered, is therefore really the center of the temple, right? It's what the entire temple is kind of built around. And we can really see, if you look at this image, it's kind of surrounded by 5 layers almost, right? So you've got the sort of the main naos at the center here. And then moving around it, we have sort of an initial corridor that sort of marks it or flanks it, essentially, which is you could kind of walk in and out and around the central area. Then you can kind of see these 13, sort of a ring of 13 square rooms here, right? That sort of go off, opening off 3 sides of the corridor to sort of create this sort of checkered pattern around the Holy of Holies there. Then moving out from there, we can see very clearly, right, there's kind of another corridor or area that's kind of with connecting doors. Now, what's really interesting is these kind of areas would have had stairs that actually led up to the roof. So they're good, and this is where Egyptians got a lot of their astronomical knowledge, especially about Sophis and the rising of Sirius, where a lot of the priests would record knowledge in the temple libraries after going up onto the roof through these corridors. We can see an outer corridor there that's sort of a bit closer to the walls, and then finally there is the exterior walls of the temple, right? So the Holy of Holies is kind of nested essentially in 5 expanding layers of corridors and rooms. And there are reasons for this, especially in the late stage temples, because it largely protects, or was thought to protect, the sanctity of the deity from the outside of the profane world. But if we start moving down the temple, right, so moving towards the right here, moving out of the Holy of Holies, coming down, again, notice that we have 5 main rooms and connecting doorways that create this kind of processional way moving inwards. If you imagine yourself walking up through, on the right-hand side, through those pylon gates and towards the Holy of Holies in the center, there are 5 rooms, essentially, that you pass through before you even get to those 5 layers that surround the Holy of Holies in the main statue. This is an accident. 5 is a very, very important number in Egyptian numerology. But again, if we look at these here, and you can notice it again, it's creating this kind of processual way, right? We can all see this. First of all, we can see that there is a sort of an anteroom or an antechamber there that's extending more or less, if you look at it, to the ends of the corridor there, and that surrounds the main sanctuary, and this main bulk here, or this main sort of extra, the first anterior room, it was called the Hall of the Ennead in Egyptian, mainly because the deities that lived there, or they dwelled in the ring of chapels around there, they opened off this corridor, they were all gathered in this main room before the chief god, essentially. So this is something very characteristic of Egyptian temples. A deity, or the main deity that was worshipped in the temple, was never the sole deity that was worshipped. The Ennead were also often worshipped, the 8 gods there who sort of were on the primeval mound of creation and forged the world. They are also worshipped in these little ring centers that you can see on the image here, right, which are really, really interesting. And in that antechamber, before the main Holy of Holies, it was thought that all the Ennead would gather in that room to give praise to the main god, who was kind of the archetypal creator, essentially. Then moving forward, you can see we've got kind of like what effectively would be an offering room, where there would be kind of libations and there would be like main offerings put down, and sometimes the priests would even eat some of these, or that's not usually the ones that were made up for sacrifice, but the ones that were left in the offering room. The temple priests would subsist themselves on those offerings as well. Then moving outwards, again, this next area that we can see here is essentially the inner sort of hypostyle hall, where people would gather and they would sort of begin the processions and move outwards. Then moving outwards again, from the inner hypostyle hall, we have the greater hypostyle hall, or what we call the greater hall. And in Egyptian, this was called the Hall of Appearance. It's where kind of the physical manifestations of the deity may appear, right? Or when spirits may appear, or certain different things would be around in different places that can give you indications for the oracular functions of the deity, essentially. And then one of the most beautiful qualities there, right at the end, you can see sort of in front of the main pylon at the gate there, we have kind of a colonnaded court of pillars, which is really beautiful. And what's really interesting is if you look sort of in from the outside here, so if you sort of come in through the pylons and come forward, this sequence of rooms essentially kind of presents what looks like the appearance of like a series of nested passageways, one within another, each surrounding the one inside. Now, there is something really interesting going on here, and it's to do with the experience of the change of consciousness. When you are moving through all of these rooms, and each one is getting smaller, and you're emerging into the nested one inside the other, it's kind of like a Russian doll, like a babushka doll, right? And you're emerging and moving through these rooms, and bear in mind there's going to be incense going, there are going to be people singing hymns, theurgy is going to be going on, so that the environment's going to be changing rapidly. As you move through this processional way, the temple, it creates a rapid sense of the change of consciousness. We move into an altered state of consciousness where you move into the hall of appearance, and then you perceive the oracular revelations of the deity. Because if you note there, from the exterior to the interior, almost every single room becomes smaller, right? So if you notice here, the larger rooms are on the right-hand side of the plan, right? So on the front end of the temple, when you first come in, you're greeted with this huge expanse, open courtyard with tons of light. And as you move deeper and deeper into the temple, the floor gets higher, the ceiling gets lower, and corresponding to all this change of space is an increasing darkness. The inner Holy of Holies had almost no light inside of it except candle light that was lit, right? Only the outside ones have main light sources. The courtyard, when you come in first through those pylon gates you see there, it was flooded with light. It was open, it was filled with pillars and a sacred lake and all this kind of stuff. Then you move forward into kind of the Hall of Appearance, essentially, which is a little bit darker. But then, even more than that, when you go into the inner rooms of those temples, like the antechamber, all these kind of things, the Hall of the Aeneid, these things, they would have lied in deep darkness. There would be no light, essentially, reaching these rooms. There would only be tiny, isolated slits in the roof and the walls that create these kind of, spotlight beams of light that are coming through. Think of, like in a castle, where you have like archers hole where archers can shoot out. They had little slits across the roof and the walls of the temple that would have let light beams in. But imagine there's only 2 or 3 of them. So you sort of move through this processional way, essentially, of decreasing light and decreasing space, and you emerge into this darkened chamber where there are these pillars and rays of sunshine coming through, coupled with incense, which would have been kaifi for the most part, which has been proven to have narcotic properties, and it alters the imagination. In fact, Plutarch argues that kaifi polishes the imagination, the imaginative faculty of the soul. So kaifi evidently increases the vividity of your imagination. So all of this stuff together, the Egyptians are creating was essentially a series of rooms that radically alters consciousness and brings you into contact with the divine, at least in their view, right? Which is an absolutely fascinating bit of technology that we're seeing here, And as I said earlier, when we get into the later periods, for the most part, these layers and these sort of temple precincts, essentially, they are largely intended to protect the god inside in the Holy of Holies, that statue, from the profane world outside. And it kind of has the effect of screening it off, essentially, right? So the profane energy, the apophis, the chaos, has to make it through all of these other like doorways and gateways in order to get into the god, essentially. And it kind of has this effect of creating a distinct boundary between the mundane and the sacred worlds, for the most part. But here's the really interesting part, because it doesn't seem, as far as we can tell, that these 5 corridor routes, when you look at a temple like this, it doesn't actually seem like these were actually intended for humans, believe it or not. As far as we can tell, no priest ever went through this succession of doorways from the outside to the inside, except when they were carrying the divine image. During festivals, the temple doors would be opened up and the god would be placed on its bark or its barge, and it would be paraded through the city or perhaps down to the Nile, because there were causeways and things that have been built in, some of which are 38, 39 foot across or 39 meters across, which are huge. But for the most part, the priests did not enter the temple this way. They didn't come in through the main gate and then slowly move through in this kind of way. It's really weird, except when they are bringing the temple precinct a procession, or they're bringing the main statue out of the temple into the city, or they're bringing it back from the city into the temple. They would have used the main gates. But outside of that, The outer doors that we're seeing here, for the most part, they remain shut. You know, even while the priests were on duty, usually after the priests would have purified themselves in the sacred lake that would have been in the main, either in the hall of, not in the hall appearances, in the main colonnade area, essentially, they would have probably entered in through the side door. They would have probably entered into one of these minor chaplets that we see on the other end of the chapel, or the temple, rather than going into through the main gate, which is really fascinating when you think about it. But the temple doors, the main doors at least, to the Holy of Holies would have been opened on procession days or festival days for the most part. The succession of rooms that we can see there, you know, the halls and the courts, it gives kind of architectural form to this root of a deity, right? It's the form, it's the route that the deity takes, not the humans. And this is one of the more interesting parts of Egyptian architecture that we see, you know. So let's look at another one, actually. Let's look at another example I want to show you. Let's go back in time a little bit to contrast this. Let's go back to the Temple of Khons at Karnak in the New Kingdom. So this is sort of a new one here. So it's a different layout, very similar, but a bit different. Now, what do you notice? First impressions, go. Drop some comments. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because there are some pronounced distinct differences. For one, that Holy of Holies is very different. Right? That place where the main deity statue would have been held is quite radically different. You know, we see this idea of centering the deity in the nous is less pronounced in the New Kingdom. You know, the Holy of Holies is surrounded by chapels and secondary rooms, yes, but not those layers of corridors that we just saw at the Temple of Horus in Edfu. You know, and the reason being, and this is a really fascinating sociological movement, I guess, that we're seeing in Egypt as it moves through time, essentially. This idea of sort of shutting the deity off, essentially, and screening it away sort of behind bars or behind sort of layers of protection, that's a distinctly late stage addition in Egyptian theology. It's largely Ptolemaic, right? There was this growing belief in late period Egypt by the native Egyptians that the country and the temple was becoming corrupted by all the Greek influence, by all the foreign influence. So they wanted to protect their deities more and more. You know, this idea doesn't seem as pronounced in earlier periods of Egyptian history, especially going back into the New Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, even though we have very few, if any, Middle Kingdom temples left standing. It doesn't seem to have been a priority for the temple builders back in the day to sort of shut off the deity, you know, or protect the deity from the profane world. It just doesn't seem to have been a thing. You know, the religion of later periods is largely dominated with this fear of the profane, as we can see. You know, if you look at the kind of the rituals that are really common in Ptolemaic era Egypt, things like the protection of the house and the body, protection of the bed, the felling of Apophis, which was a Sekhmet ritual largely, the warding off of evil, you know, all of these kind of different kinds of rituals, they are largely protective and exorcistic in nature, right? They are trying to protect things, especially the deity in question, or give power to the deity in question, not so much about enlivening the deity. Whereas in earlier periods, they seem to have been much more relaxed about the protections for the most part. So now the last thing I want to cover here is something that's really interesting. It's this idea that the temple represents the entire cosmos as a whole. And this is somewhere where I think it's going to be really, really useful for both modern ceremonial magicians and modern sort of architectural people to look at this, right? Because in later periods, there are a lot of writings, especially on papyri, that talk about the Egyptian temple being the representation of the cosmos itself, that the temple is kind of an earthly reflection of the higher form or the higher cosmos, essentially. And the way we know this, if we sort of do a quick run-through overview of the symbolism in temples. When you walk into an Egyptian temple, the floor is Geb. The floor represents the earth that you're walking on. The ceiling represents the sky. And then if you look at any of the Egyptian columns, the Egyptians are very famous for their plant and tree style columns. That's intentional because the columns are meant to represent the plants and the trees growing out of the earth and stretching towards the sky. Right? And then you look at the walls, and all the walls are painted with hieroglyphs and usually natural pastoral scenes, you know, marshy scenes, all that kind of thing. And there are processions of figures and all these things that are personifications of the fruitfulness of the earth and the fertility of Geb there. And they always face the inner part of the temple, bearing offerings to the main god, right? And again, art was alive in Egyptian character. And something that I think is absolutely beautiful, and this is a really, really cool reconstruction here. But one of the things that's really cool is since the ceiling was the sky, it was meant to represent the sky, it would have originally been painted with stars and the Milky Way and various zodiac signs and all these kinds of things, right? Astronomical representations. And between the floor and the ceiling, so when you walk into a temple, you are between earth and sky. And between that, on all the walls, are all these decorations on the walls of endless cult scenes that fill the kind of the stony cosmos as an effigy with action and life. You know, in the same way that the world around us is filled with residential things and light and life and bustling cities, the temple in itself represents the world. On the floor, you have the earth and the dirt. On the ceiling, you have the sky and the stars. And around you on the walls, you have depictions of people in daily life, giving offerings and giving praises to gods and all these kinds of things, right? So the temple in itself is an effigy of the entire cosmos. It's very much kind of as above, so below on full display, right? Now, there is an interesting kind of mirroring contradiction here when we think about this, I think, because when you look at a temple from the outside, for the most part, they kind of appear as these sort of locked off sanctuaries, essentially, that kind of house the small divine presence within that is kind of sheltered from the world, surrounded by all these columns of protection. But if you're on the inside of the temple, it's kind of completely the opposite, essentially. All of these symbolic associations, the Egyptian temple is the world itself. When the priest steps into the temple, he steps back in time to the mythic time. He transitions from mundane time to mythic time. And that transition is facilitated by a change in architecture, a change in consciousness, all these kinds of things. And as they do that, they step into the center of the world itself, because the temple represents the entire world. They are at the center of the cosmos, and they are emulating the creator deity Amun by being back in mythical time on top of the hill of creation. So that when they speak their will, doing magic, for example, then it emanates out into the whole world and creates change, essentially. Now, what's really interesting about this is the cult image, that statue of the deity that embodies the deity's essence and the presence. Yes, the image fills the temple with an emanation of divine presence, but at the same time, if we look at it symbolically, the god is filling the entire cosmos with the radiance of their manifestation. So yes, on the micro level, there is the cult statue that fills the temple with its light and its presence. But if we take the understanding that the temple represents the entire world, from that temple emanates out the god's presence, because the god is dwelling in the center of creation there and emanates out its presence and its essence into the world. So in the same way that the statue emanates presence into the temple emanates the divine presence and energy out into the world. And the Egyptians knew this. And that's why they are so pious. They keep up all their religious rituals and their offerings, because they are attempting to keep that divine presence radiating out into the world to beautify it, essentially. And the naos there, in which the cult statue rests, is supposed to be kind of the remotest part of the sky, the akhet, the horizon, there, where the gods and the goddesses dwell in Egyptian mythology, right? The doors of the shrine that we can see, they are the celestial gates, essentially, that the sun god Ra passes through every morning. That processional way of the temple, it mirrors the sun's journey from east to west, right? Which is always really interesting. And the remainder of the temple is essentially, it's the world that the sun god kind of moves through and floods light in when he appears in the east, The temple, this is the important and most important part, the temple recalls the mythical primeval mound, the Ben, that stood on the first soil that emerged from Nun, the primeval waters of creation. Right? And on that mound, the creator god stands and first begins his work of creation, usually through speech there, which is why speech was so important in Egyptian magic. And through a long chain of renewals, which is really interesting when you think about it, the present temple that we're working in, it's a direct descendant of that original sanctuary that was created by Amun, right? The original first temple. Every temple in Egypt is in some way a direct descendant of that first temple. And every temple has a kind of an origin myth around it that structures all the creation stories associated with every temple, And to a certain extent, even archaeologically, this is kind of true, because temples were often refashioned and reworked over the years. right? So much so that there is a bit of truth behind this myth that temples kind of are descendants of the primeval man or the primeval temple. They kind of were. In fact, there are some temples in Edfu that have remained going all the way back to the Old Kingdom and even the pre-dynastic in 2900 BC, and they've been continually added to all this time. And all the new temples are built over the top of the old temples. Of course, the old temples are desacralized, and then the new ones are sort of re-embodied by the deity, essentially. And we have parallels to that in Mesopotamian sources, things like the Ugarbatu ritual and things like that. But every temple in Egypt, for the most part, is almost standing on the same spot of an older, more ancient temple that was then added to over time and mythologized over the years. So in a way, there is a bit of archaeological evidence for this myth that the temples are descendants of the primeval temples. They are descendants of religious sanctuaries that were built probably during the middle of the Old Kingdom, and then they just kept adding to them again and again. So all of these are fascinating qualities of Egyptian temples, especially this idea of how we embody space and how we move through space. So with that, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know what you thought below. I'll see you guys next time.